Hi, Emma here from Old Town Hypnotherapy. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I did a book review of my 5 best self-help books. One of those books that I reviewed was a book called Good Grief by Dipti Tate. And I promised you at the time that I was going to interview Dipti Tate in a few weeks' time. And that is today. Dipti, if you've not come across her before, is absolutely amazing. Apart from being one of the best hypnotherapists that I know, she is an author, as we know from Good Grief. She has been in the Mail Online, the Daily Mail, Woman's Running, Glamour, New, the BBC, BBC Radio, Cotswold Life, The Sun and Net Doctor. So Dipti knows what she's talking about. And so without further ado, we're going to interview Dipti today about her book, Good Grief. So welcome, Dipti. It's so nice to speak to you. And we're going to talk today about your book, Good Grief. How are you doing over there? How is it over in the Cotswolds?
It's actually lovely. It's actually sunny here today, which is really, really nice. I actually had to move my computer because I was just sitting in the sunshine, but I was getting all bleached out, so I had to kind of keep moving. So if I have to keep moving, it's because the sun is shining. Which is
lovely. Out of the spotlight. So yeah, we come to talk to. I promised all my my clients and my listeners that I was going to interview about your book. So that's what we're going to do. It's an absolutely amazing book, and it's such a pleasure to talk to you today, Dipti. And so we just want to ask you some questions. Now, what I wanted to know first of all is basically what inspired you to write Good Grief in the first place?
Okay, well, this is an interesting question because I didn't actually set out to write a book ever. I know we've all got a book in us, but I didn't think, right, now I'm going to sit here and write a book about grief. But the reason why it came about was because I lost both my parents to cancer, one when I was in my 20s and then the other one when I was in my 30s. I'm an only child, so I didn't really have like any brothers and sisters to share that sort of experience with, and cousins and everything are there, but it's not the same. When you lose your parents, you can't really connect with other members of the family because they're not their parents, you know. So I found I was all on my own with these feelings, and so what started to happen was that I realised that there was kind of patterns within my feelings. So I started to write what I'd call now my grief diary. So I had 7 notebooks, and each one was called the feeling I was in at the time. So, for example, one of them would be loneliness, or one of them would be sadness, one of them would be guilt or fear. So I every time I felt that emotion, I'd just basically do a brain dump of words and feelings and just thoughts into these notebooks. So then these notebooks became kind of my grief diaries, really, and eventually I had quite a lot of material in each notebook, and I was wondering, what do I do with all of this? Do I just stick them up in the loft and forget about them? And then I had a coaching session with somebody, and I was telling them about these grief diaries, and she said, "Oh, do you mind if I read them?" And I was like, "Oh, no."
Well, that's personal.
Yeah, I was like, "Well, okay, I don't, kind of, okay." So I gave them to her, and she said, "You know what? There's a book in this. Should we do some work on that and figure out how we can get the book out of this?" And so that's what I did. So I went I kind of, had the coaching and the book came out of that.
So that's really fascinating. So who did you write it for primarily?
Well, I guess originally it was for me. That was the whole idea was, this is for me. This is my cathartic vent. This is the way I am processing. This is the way I am coping. And for me, to get it all out of my head and written down onto a piece of paper was actually a way of healing and understanding. I had a lot of insights that came through those processes of writing. So really, it was originally for me, and then as we then went into the coaching, moving it forward for a reader or an audience, I realised that actually grief is something that touches everybody. So it doesn't have to actually be when someone dies, but I know that we're going to talk about this in a bit about it's not just about death, but that's what I realised through the book. It's when I was lost death perspective, I realised that there was parallels with other things that had happened in my life, divorce or.
Right. I was going to ask you that, Dipti, because that's one thing that it struck me is when I read it, one thing that I didn't appreciate, because death of close loved ones hasn't really touched me an awful lot in my life, but when I read your book, it sort of stood out to me. Grief isn't just about death of loved ones, and that's something that I'm quite naive to, and so I was really interested to read is it goes into a whole other spectrum, doesn't it? Can you talk a bit about that, what grief is?
Well, I always say to everybody, you have the ability to grieve if you've had the ability to love. So when you've loved something, it could be something, someone, and at a time in your life, for example, and that goes away or that finishes or it's lost, then there's a hole kind of that's left. There isn't, unless you've kind of had it's a shelf. There's a shelf life. You go, okay, I'm in a job, I'm contracting, I'm going to be working here for 3 months, and you kind of know there's an end point, then you probably won't grieve that job, if that makes sense, because you've kind of had it in your head that there's a sort of a ring-fenced boundary around that particular aspect. But when it's an open-ended thing, us as human beings, we kind of have this illusion that things are going to last forever, that we are... there is no sort of disposability there, and there's that kind of that illusion really of this will always be like it is. So when that comes to an end for whatever reason, there is this sort of bit of us that's left that is a gap, I suppose, and I think in that gap sits grief. So that's how I would describe what grief is.
So when I've had clients who've come to me, somebody jumps to mind at the moment who wrote to me recently about their relationship had ended suddenly and unexpectedly, and they were really reaching out for some help for just being able to move on. This is the sort of thing that will help. That is grief, and this book will help somebody like that who's trying to move on with life from something that has finished that was out of their control and that they didn't wish.
Exactly. So there is that gap. What do I do now? How do I feel? My experience with what I did have. So grief isn't a negative. It's just what is there. If that makes sense. But sometimes we can perceive it in a negative way because usually negative emotions surround that loss or that change. So what I teach in the book most significantly is to understand, going back to those grief diaries, to understand that actually all of the emotions have a value and they have a place, and they have a value and a place with your healing and your through understanding each emotion, you can then move into what I call acceptance. And acceptance is actually accepting that is the case, that is how I'm feeling, and then it doesn't feel so scary, or you're not trying to resist it or push it away or pretend it's not happening and sweep it under the carpet. You're actually looking at it in a what we would call the solution-focused way, understanding the value in that experience or that emotion, and then giving it a home really in your head and saying, okay, I understand I'm going to feel a bit guilty here, or I understand I'm going to feel fearful here. So the interesting thing is, though, the only emotion I think that doesn't have a value, but this is my personal opinion, is guilt. I think guilt is really damaging. I can see why people have guilt, but I can't really see a value of it. So that's quite an interesting one. But I can see a value of anxiety. I can see a value of loneliness. I can see the value of fear. I kind of get the values of all the other ones, but not really guilt. So interesting.
That's really interesting, Dipti. Thank you. So if you could sum up overall, just sum up the message that you want to get across from this book, how would you do that? What would you say?
I would say that this very simple message here is that grief is something that applies to all of us when we've lost something significant or changed in a significant way. And to remember that nobody is alone. Everybody has an ability to connect and to reach out and to understand that feeling of being lonely in a crowded room doesn't have to be like that. So remember, you're not alone is my message.
Thank you, Dipti. And where can I get it? Where can I buy the book?
I have 2 websites actually. So my personal one-to-one working with me page is called thecotswoldpractice.com, and then there is a section just on grief, and then my Skype sessions website is hellorelax.net, and there's a grief page on that as well.
Oh, fabulous. So if people wanted to get in touch and work with you personally, maybe somebody's going through this at the moment and they need a bit of help, they can work with you personally through Skype or through your private practice, which is in the Cotswolds. Cotswold practice.
Yes, so I work from Cirencester in the Cotswolds, so that's my one-to-one practice, and that is thecotswoldpractice.com. And then on Skype, it's hellorelax.net.
Lovely. And your book's on Amazon?
It is, but you can also buy signed copies from me personally, and on both of those websites that I've mentioned, you've got the availability of buying on through me, so I can then give you a signed copy.
Fabulous.
You can just get one on Amazon too.
Thanks. I will put those details in with this and underneath the YouTube, so people can access you in that and find you that way as well. So thank you so much, Dipti. That's really, really, really fascinating and fantastic. And yes, good luck with the sales of the book.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you so much. It's been lovely speaking to you.